The practice of law in central Illinois was very different in the 19th century than it is today. The courtrooms were much less formal. You would find spittoons in the courtroom. If you spat in a courtroom today, you'd probably get contempt of court. But not only that, the courtroom was a place of entertainment. This is a time where there's no television, there's no movies, there's no internet, there's no smartphones. And if you wanted entertainment, what would you do? Well, when the judge and the lawyers ride into town, you would go to the courthouse and you would watch the cases.
Lawyers would be on display like baked goods, up for tasting. People would walk up and down the long tables and choose an attorney.
Oh, it was a great event. It was almost like a week of festivity. Courts was big entertainment in those days.
People came in from the countryside when they knew court was going to be in session. The outside on the lawn attracted a lot of excitement, and so there would be magicians out there, and there were musicians who were playing.
And the galleries would be packed with people waiting to see their favorite lawyers come through and argue a case, among whom were Stephen Douglas and the tall, laconic, but very amusing Abraham Lincoln.
The main challenge for attorneys at that time was travel. The state of Illinois is broken down into circuits. So each circuit in Lincoln's time comprised anywhere from 5 to 15 counties. And then so that circuit was basically where the legal cases took place.
So Lincoln did something called riding circuit. He would ride around the 8th Judicial Circuit in central Illinois taking cases. And basically a lot of lawyers would get on their horses and ride around from town to town, county to county, and a judge would go with them.
There were almost impassable roads, very ill-defined, that ran through the prairies of central Illinois. Prairie grasses grew quite tall. They could be taller than a man standing on the ground, or they could reach the height of a man on horseback. So it was very hard to navigate the prairie grasses to go from one county seat to the next county seat.
They didn't have Super 8s or Hampton Inns or things like that, so basically they would stay in taverns, which doubled as hotels. David Davis, who was the judge of the 8th Circuit, he wrote many letters to his wife explaining what life was like traveling, and he was constantly talking about being eaten by mosquitoes and bed bugs and how the food was horrible.
Often they had to share two to a bed, some sleeping on the floor. Davis mentions in one letter he is elated because he got a straw bed. Mount Pulaski was perhaps the tavern that everybody feared the most, and he described it as a place that was filthy, dirty, and the eating terrible. The only person who didn't seem to mind them was Abraham Lincoln. When he was in the courtroom, he knew when to question and when to back off. He knew when to use humor and when it was not appropriate to use humor. And he also was wonderful at understanding the argument of his opponent. And so he would say something like, my opponent has a good argument for this point, and also a very well-reasoned argument on that point. But of course, he's setting it up then so he could pick it apart, and he was a great success at that.
In these sort of moments, you can see how Lincoln is gaining the trust of people to be able to admit that the other side had a point, whereas most lawyers would want to hide the evidence that hurt their cause. Leonard Swett said that if you thought Lincoln was as harmless as a dove, you would find that he was actually as shrewd as a serpent. And if you weren't careful, you'd find yourself laid up in a ditch.
As he grew as an attorney, he became what was known as a lawyer's lawyer. So if there was a case before the Illinois Supreme Court and an attorney lived in Galena, well, they don't want to make the 3 or 4 day journey to Springfield, so they would hire Lincoln to handle their case for him.
As Lincoln grew, so did the circuit. So the caseload became more diverse and more significant. The big change was railroads.
He was being brought in on really high-profile cases. One of the biggest questions was this railroad taxation case, and because of Lincoln's argument in that case, it kept the Illinois Central Railroad from going bankrupt.
And by the time Lincoln runs for the presidency, Lincoln had something like 300 cases that he argued before the Illinois Supreme Court. So you had to be a pretty outstanding lawyer to take a case all the way up to the Supreme Court level.
I would just love to see Lincoln coming into town. I would love to see this gigantic guy, 6'4", with a 1-foot stovepipe hat, right? He's over 7 feet. I would just like to see the presence. Did people turn? Did people look and think, this is an unusual looking fellow? What does the future hold? I would just love to have been witness to one of those entrances into a small town, because it must have been startling. The one thing we should never forget about Lincoln is not only was he a good lawyer, not only was he tireless on the circuit, but he was an amazing presence. He was a giant in an era when there were no giants, and it must have been a spectacular recollection for people.
The importance of the circuit is the relationships that Abraham Lincoln built. One of his overlooked skills was networking. The man must have had tremendous charisma, so people just gravitated to him.
Lincoln had this uncanny ability to win people over in general, and so when he interacts with lawyers and litigants, they all grow to love him.
He would go to these taverns. It was primarily a place to stay. Lincoln would regale him at night with the lawyers and whoever else could jam into the space. He would regale him with stories. And all that stuff about his fame as a storyteller is true. He was a marvelous storyteller.
And so by going from community to community, Lincoln is meeting people, he's hobnobbing, he's getting to know his fellow attorneys well, he's getting to know the judges well, and that's all going to be instrumental.
The people that Lincoln associated with on the circuit, probably the biggest name is David Davis.
David Davis comes to Bloomington in 1836, and he probably meets Lincoln at some point, but the first time he sees Lincoln, sparks do not fly, I'm sorry to say. They don't become close friends until Davis is riding the circuit with Lincoln all the time. Davis writes a letter, and Davis says, I really have no one who has the intelligence that I seek to make a pleasant companion. So he's very lonely for an intellectual equal. Lincoln was the man who came along who had this incredible intelligence combined with humor, and he was the one who fulfills this void in Davis's emotional life. And I think many scholars would say it was one of the closest friendships Lincoln had during this time period.
Another person that Lincoln associated with is Ward Hill Lamon. Lamon was an attorney from Danville.
He was a great partier, a ladies' man, and sang bawdy songs and enjoyed the good sides of life. But Lincoln befriended him, and they tried cases together.
Lamon and Lincoln kind of entered into an informal legal partnership. So he had a formal partnership with William Herndon, but when he was traveling the circuit, he exclusively took cases with Ward Hill Lamon in Danville, Champaign, the eastern counties on the circuit.
Lincoln kept that friendship into the White House and got some criticism. It became a controversy when the extremists in the party were trying to give Lincoln a hard time. Lamon's friendship was an issue, but that never stopped him. And he must have been a really likable guy. I don't know if I'd want to have been his law partner, but...
It's Lincoln's fellow attorneys that are central to him winning the Republican nomination for president in 1860. In 1860, it's a fellow attorney that convinces the Republican Party to hold their convention in Chicago, which is home ground for Abraham Lincoln. And it's David Davis who goes to Chicago and essentially works as Lincoln's campaign manager. So the circuit is central to Lincoln's rise to power.
To be on the road was to be not only in courtrooms, but the homes of political leaders. And when he wasn't talking to local political people, He was talking to newspaper editors, and newspaper editors were also political people. In the early days, they were pro-Whig or pro-Democrat. In the 50s, they were pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. Lincoln courted these newspaper men.
When Lincoln was running for president, you couldn't campaign for yourselves. You didn't go out and give speeches. You didn't debate your opponent. So you would basically have these surrogates who would go out and speak on your behalf. So Ward Hill Lamon did that. David Davis did that. Leonard Swett did that. Henry Clay Whitney did that. So there were a bunch of these attorneys who spoke on behalf of Lincoln, saying what a great guy he was.
In a sense, I think it's fair to say, had he not had that circuit experience, had he not built a base in central Illinois, he would not have had a starting point for his political career. The circuit is his introduction into widening his field of acquaintanceships and supporters.
Those towns meant a lot to him, and the associations that he made, and with the lawyers, I call it Lincoln's ladder to the presidency, because those were the people that got him nominated.
Lincoln would deal with many constitutional issues during the Civil War. He would deal with emancipation. He would deal with the arrest of civilians. He would deal with printing money. And I think his training as a lawyer taught him to read laws and the constitutional text very carefully. He would look at the Constitution and he would say, okay, what does this allow? What does it not allow? Where does it speak plainly? Where is it silent? Where might it allow me to do something and where does it not? And I think his thinking and training as a lawyer then taught him how to make those sort of decisions.
Lincoln's experience on the circuit influenced him because he was a lawyer as a president. He did not have a lot of administrative experience, but his legal experience filled that gap very nicely.
The Republican Party was this fusion party, so he wanted to have his cabinet reflect that. That's why you had former Democrats, you had former Whigs, you had former know-nothings who eventually became part of his cabinet. Most of these people were lawyers. So Lincoln is looking at his cabinet as a law firm, which he, as the head, is managing. And so I think surrounding himself in his cabinet with people who had differences of opinions with him allowed him to kind of take in all of these differing viewpoints and then make what he thought was the best judgment.
Lincoln believed that secession was illegal and unconstitutional. At the same time, Lincoln did believe that there was a right of revolution. You can overthrow the government if your plainly written rights are being violated. But then Lincoln made the case that that's not what was happening in 1861.
So when he comes into the White House, the position that Lincoln has taken is that he hates slavery. There's no doubt about that. But he's a lawyer, and as a lawyer president, he has to respect the fact that to some degree, the U.S. Constitution protects slavery in the states where it already existed. So he argues it from a legal point of view. Those Emancipation Proclamation orders only extend through those states that have illegally seceded from the Union.
This was a very technical legal document that he was writing, and he knew that this was a war measure. That's why he also campaigned hard for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which declared slavery illegal everywhere.
A writ of habeas corpus tells the person detaining the prisoner to bring the body of that person into court and to explain what is the justification for imprisoning this person. But Lincoln looked at the situation in April of 1861. Congress was out of session, so they weren't there to do anything about it, and he had a rebellion on his hands.
What Lincoln was doing as president is that he was rounding up people and putting them in prison without saying why he's putting them in prison. And by suspending the writ of habeas corpus, now these people didn't have a way to get out of these prisons that they were being put into.
And from Lincoln's perspective, the Constitution actually doesn't say who has this power. It just says it shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. David Davis was really wary of Lincoln's use of martial law, and in particular, Lincoln's use of military courts to try civilians. And there are a lot of people who would argue that Lincoln abused this power. Democrats during the Civil War certainly saw him as abusing the power, and many today also still see it as a black mark on Lincoln's record.
When he was president, even in the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln saw ordinary people twice a week, people who would line up outside the White House office, down the steps, and wait for 10 minutes or 10 seconds with the chief magistrate. The remarkable thing is Lincoln's willingness to see them. And even in the days when he was up all night, when he was in the telegraph office receiving terrible battle news, he said, "I came from them and I want to continue my relationship with them." He called these his public opinion baths. So I do think constant exposure to clients, to audiences and the spectators, to editors, all prepared him to not be a snob. I don't think he ever lost that touch. I don't think it was put on. I think it was genuine. Going on the circuit pushed him out to a wider group of people. It forced him to socialize, to entertain, to recruit. So the circuit was crucial in his development as a public person.
Because he was a lawyer, because he was trained in the law, he saw the law as something that was designed to bring order to society, to be there for the good of the people. And that's the way he had approached his presidency. His legal training made him cautious, made him careful, but made him respect the law. And that, in the long run, he knew was the protection for U.S. citizens, was that we follow the law, that we do things lawfully to achieve our goals.
I think a lot of Americans know about Lincoln's early life. He grew up in a log cabin. He had abject poverty. They know about his presidency. They know about emancipation. They know about his assassination. But this part of the Lincoln story often doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And I hope that it gives us an appreciation for just how hard he worked. This was a guy who pulled himself up by the bootstraps, who wanted to make something of himself, and being a lawyer was the way for him to get there.